Westchester County Executive George Latimer wants his next stop to be Washington. He's running for Congress against incumbent Jamaal Bowman, who has refused numerous invitations to appear here on the Point. This has been the most expensive primary congressionally in the entire nation. And as you can see from all the mailings that have gone out, it is an amazing amount of money that's being spent on this race. Why has this been so expensive, and why is there a need to spend so much money, not only on mailers, but on robocalls and TV advertising, the whole 9 yards?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Marcia, because my first race for public office came for the Rye City Council in a community, my home community of 15,000 people. And I think I had 1 or 2 mailings in the whole campaign, and I knocked on doors, and that's the way I campaign. And I've always campaigned that way, up to and including county executive, where, you know, we didn't have this overwhelming TV situation. My opponent has a nationwide network of support. It connects into Bernie Sanders, Our Revolution, and you can't compete with that unless you can generate money as well. We've generated in this campaign the majority of our money from within the district, and the vast majority of his money, 90% of his money, comes from outside the district. So what I'm watching is a nationwide effort to keep him in this seat. And I think what you're watching, if you're looking at it from the outside, is that my base is local in all the zip codes of this district. Now, the money that's involved in competing does require you to communicate in all the means of communication, but we weren't the first to the mailboxes, and we weren't, you know, the first to make these things. Does this mean
that, would you support some kind of campaign finance reform going forward?
Yeah, I would.
Because, I mean, some would say that this is an obscene amount of money that's being spent.
Well, keep in mind, you know, a lot of these expenditures are coming from independent groups that are outside of the control of myself as a candidate, and arguably him as well. I would certainly support much stronger campaign restrictions, but keep in mind that it's the Supreme Court, through Citizens United, and way back when, Buckley versus Vallejo, that said that the spending of money in a campaign is equivalent to free speech. So the Supreme Court has to be willing to consider constitutional some legislative parameters that we would put around it.
So this race has been really ugly. There have been charges of racism, of anti-Semitism. Do you think these charges are fair?
Well, no, but I think, as you remember, when we had this conversation 6 months ago when I first got into the race, I was very precise about not criticizing the incumbent on a personal level.
He hasn't stopped from doing that.
No. He's been more than happy from the minute he began his campaign to make personal attacks on me. So I think at some point in time, the people in the district understand that you have a right to defend yourself. And when people make charges or they make accusations about your record that are not true, you push back on them. We've had a progressive record in Westchester. We've had a bipartisan record in Westchester. We've done things from cutting county property taxes to doing black maternal health care and reducing the cost of child care. That's the actual record. If I were the incumbent in this race and I had a strong record in Congress, I wouldn't talk about my challenger. Why would I care? I can tell you why I've been an outstanding congressman. So the fact that they've launched off with attacks on me, I think bespeaks of the problem that he has in being able to make his case. I'm making my case all across the district to people of all different backgrounds, and I'm getting a good response.
So there's been a big issue in this district about who supports Israel and who supports aid to Israel, et cetera. And just recently, Mr. Bowman apologized for claiming that charges that there were rapes and child murders on October 7th by Hamas. He said they were lies, and now he's apologized for them. Do you accept his apology?
Well, I accept his apology. I think the real apology belongs to all of the women that were raped and had hideous things happen to them, and children being killed. The fact that he, as late as 3 days before an election, 4 days before an election, took to that point of time to apologize tells me that he's probably seeing the political downside of holding to that position previously. But I'll accept his apology. And what's more important is to understand that we are not framed just by this campaign. It's what we believed and what we said beforehand. I've been a supporter of Israel, but not a blank check. But I understand that Israel is a state that has legitimacy, and it has a right to exist under defensible borders. And he's been hostile to Israel over an extended period of time. That hostility was reflected before I got in the race. You had many Jewish groups that had much difficulty with him. So his apologies now, I guess, are welcomed, but they're also coming just before an election.
So let's talk about this. I know it's been an ugly race, it's been an intense race, but I think that what voters in Westchester and the Bronx really care about is what you can do to improve their lives. Right. And I wonder, if you were to go to Washington, what your priorities would be and what you think you could do for the people who you represent.
Well, I'll give you just a couple of examples. There's a multitude of examples. I think affordability in general is important, and one of the things that I would prioritize is the restoration of the SALT tax deduction, which was taken away.
That would have been my first question.
It absolutely has hurt people of all different ethnic backgrounds, all different levels of income, and there are homeowners who are house rich and cash poor in the south side of Mount Vernon, in parts of Portchester, and in Harrison and Eastchester, and in Wakefield, all across, who have lost a big chunk of affordability because they're now paying money on taxes that they did not have the use of that money. It went to the state. So I think that's a priority, and that should be something you talk about on a regular basis and put a bipartisan group together to work against. But I'll give you another example, a more practical example. Affordable housing is important. What would I do as a congressman along those lines? I would go to the leader of the Democratic Conference, Hakeem Jeffries, let's say he's the speaker, and I'd say to his staff person, Mr. Speaker, get me an appointment with the Region 3 Director for Housing and Urban Development based here in Manhattan. I want to go in with facts and figures about what we're doing for projects that are pending in New Rochelle, in Larchmont, in Wakefield, wherever there may be. Go in with facts and figures, and I would, as the salesman that I once was, pitch why we need that support for these local projects. I wouldn't waste my time making a speech in some other part of the country about how affordable housing is right. I would worry about how could I get that revenue. I did that in Albany successfully when I served representing Westchester in both houses of the state legislature. That's what a legislator can do.
But you're taking a big leap of faith that the Democrats are going to take control of the House come November. That's going to be a tough race.
Well, anything can happen, and who sits in the White House and who sits in leadership of both houses are very much up in the air. Obviously, I'm a Democrat. I support Democrats in these positions, but I was in the minority in the state Senate, and I was in the Assembly when there was a Republican governor in the state level. I still got bills passed and signed into law. It's not easy to do, and you have to pick your spots. And I would look for allies across the aisle on given issues. Doesn't mean we agree on some issues, but we find an issue like flooding. Flooding's a major issue in Westchester County, and it affects the Bronx as well. There are Republican Congress members who have flooding problems too. So you try to work across the aisle on those issues. When you sit in an extreme element of the House with 10 people in the squad, and you don't develop broad-based relationships in your conference, and you have no relationships across the aisle, you're not going to accomplish those things. I would look for those relationships to try to make progress.
A lot of people in your district are concerned about the fact that Social Security and Medicare, the funding for that is running out. The question is, would you be able to find ways to fund it? Would it be taxes? Or, like the Republicans, want to let it just expire. So what would you do?
Well, we can't let it expire, and we can't let those programs die.
But how do you fund it?
Well, the national program that would move it, let's assume that you do have a House leadership that's prepared to pass a bill. You would look at how you would fund it given the existing revenue streams and where you'd have to increase them. But, well, taxes are one of the revenue streams. But you can't sit here and say, here's what I'm going to do to make this happen. You have to have a full plan. I've learned now, because I've been a legislator for 30 years prior to being an executive. Rather than speak generically, as people do, we're going to raise taxes on the rich. Let's put a plan together. If the plan makes sense and it shows that it can fund Social Security and Medicaid care for a more extended period of time, then that becomes a sensible plan you can vote for, not just in theory, but in practicality. And if it involves additional taxation, then you show where that taxation would come from, and you tell the American people, this is what the money is going for. It's not just, I'm going to raise taxes with an open-ended situation. We've shown during my tenure in county government that we can manage the government effectively and not just raise taxes, but we had the revenue to do things like make buses free, like provide additional funding for neighborhood health centers. We were able to do that within our revenue streams because we were smart managers of money. And you can do that at the federal level if you want to. You have to want to do it.
But we have about 15 seconds left. Do you really think you're going to be able to do that?
Look, I've got to try. And I think every Congress member goes not thinking that they're going to be the answer to the question, but they're going to participate with other committed people to try to turn it around. If we don't do that, Marcia, then we're not going to have democracy.
And on that note, we're going to have to leave it right there for now. But our conversation continues right after the show on our streaming channel, CBS News New York. We're back with a bonus conversation you'll only see here on CBS News New York. So I'd like to continue talking to you about your priorities. I wonder how you feel the country should be dealing with the migrant crisis and what's been going on at the border.
Well, I think pretty clearly you need legislation to resolve the issue. The executive branch power of the president is not sufficient to do the things that are necessary. And it's going to take a bipartisan effort if you're going to get it through both houses. That effort should include greater...
There was a bipartisan
I know,
effort.
and it was stopped because, President Trump, former President Trump, wanted it stopped. I think you need to restart that engine, and it has to be bipartisanship. You have to find common ground here. You're not going to be able to implement it unless you have an agreement. That agreement will have to include greater border security. I don't think you need a border wall, a physical wall from the Rio Grande to the Pacific Ocean.
But should you limit the number of people who come into the country?
I think you have to properly control the flow so that you can vet them. And if you put together a program that changes the asylum program, makes it a more practical program, you have the ability to adjudicate cases faster, and that does mean more courts and more assistant judges and things of that nature, then you can manage that flow. We cannot have unlimited flow coming into the country. There are limits. But there's also a need for employment, a need for workers coming from over the border. And they're needed less in the big cities than they are in the agricultural areas.
So should we ease the work permit process?
It's not a question of easing it. It's a question of rechanneling it into a more practical way of handling it. Right now, you have people coming over the border.
You have to wait forever to get a work permit now.
That's correct. And that's part of what the change needs to be. But the change needs to involve 4 and 5 different pieces together. It has to be negotiated. And if you can do that, now maybe politically it can't get done because of the ideology on both extremes that don't accept either end. But the answer to the question is legislation that involves border security, changing the asylum program, work program changes, path to citizenship and what that looks like, and then also a commitment to make sure that the migration flow does not flow directly just to New York City as it's doing now, Chicago, LA, that it goes into the areas where the workforce is needed. And in many places, those are states that resist having any migrants at all. You cannot have them just in one or two places.
Isn't that really because of the swing state issue and that
it's because
Republicans are concerned about the politics of taking those?
It's totally because of politics. It's a Republican governor in Texas saying, I'm not sending them to Republican Nebraska, even though they're needed for the workforce in Nebraska. We're going to send them to New York City because we can sell that politically in Texas. New York City, wants migrants. Good, let them have all the migrants. And that's why you have the financial problems you have that are on the back of the city of New York, which is untenable.
So Israel, as you know, has been a big issue in the campaign. I wonder if you agree with Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader at the present time, who said that Bibi Netanyahu needs to go.
I've met with Yair Lapid, who's one of the individuals who may be competing against Netanyahu, and I thought he was a very impressive guy. But to try to deal with the problem today, I don't think, for my purposes, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, Mitch McConnell, Mike Johnson, heading chambers have every right to comment. But as an individual member, were I to be a congressman, it's more important for us to look at the long-term future of how we're going to negotiate this. We need to negotiate a future that involves Israel at the table and involves the Arab countries at the table. Not Hamas, but the Arab countries. And I don't advance that by saying what I think ought to happen in
So you're saying a two-state solution?
Well, yes. I believe a two-state solution is the only way to have permanent peace. But it has to be negotiated, and both sides have to make concessions. And a lot of the discussion right now has been focused only on Israel and their role to play, and the criticism of Netanyahu, and there's things to criticize him for, that doesn't take into account a proper level of criticism over Hamas. Many of the people who criticize Netanyahu, and they talk about Netanyahu all the time, they neglect the fact that Hamas is a terrorist organization that's running Gaza, and they have no intent to negotiate anything unless they can be forced to the table in some fashion. I'd like to see it done diplomatically. I don't know how that happens. So my basic position is this. I trust the president and his negotiating team. They need to have wide berth to negotiate what they can. Blinken goes to Qatar. He goes to Jordan. He flies to Egypt, back to Israel. He's trying to make... While he's doing that, he doesn't need George Latimer to say what his position is on this, that, or the other thing. And so I would counsel future colleagues of mine, focus your direction through the system, through your leader of your house, and to the president. And let's see if that can move us to get to the table.
But, a lot of the things that you talk about really depend, I think, on the Democrats flipping the House, which could be a difficult. I mean, if you look at the polls today, right, which show President Trump ahead in most of the 6 of the 7 swing states, it may be a difficult thing for the Democrats to to flip the House. But there are big races here in New York, not only yours, but also, I mean, right next to you, Mike Lawler versus Mondaire Jones.
Right.
That's going to be a tough race.
It is, and if we were having this conversation on October 25th instead of just before June 25th, all of those poll data would be, you know, very concerning for a person who's a Democrat. But there's a long time to go. As we're speaking today, we haven't seen the first Trump-Biden debate. That's yet ahead of us. And we don't know how many of these tight U.S. Senate races are going to play out and the other House races. So that's still ahead of us. I don't presume that the Democrats will automatically take control. I don't presume I'm going to win in a couple of days. I presume if I work hard and make a sensible argument, I can win, and I think that's the extrapolation for others. But the point I'm driving at overall is we have to find a way to be able to dialogue regardless of what the outcome is on Election Day. And as I've said already, I've served as a Democrat under Republican majority city council, county legislature, state senate, and we still were able to function. And it requires the individuals to respect each other under disagreement. We disagree about certain things, but find the areas of common agreement. I go to Washington willing to work in my party to advance the issues that my party prioritizes, but willing to work across the aisle to find common ground where we can. And that's a different strategy than the strategy of the incumbent.
But you know, you have the polls for President Biden right now are pretty grim. And I wonder if you think that he should, at this point, even though it's late, step aside for somebody else who might have a better chance of running.
I don't think that's a realistic situation right now. President Biden is going to be the Democratic standard bearer. He is going to face former President Trump. That's going to be the choice. Whatever other factors that people may think, that's the choice that's going to come down to. And I think people have to look at what will the world look like in 2025. Are we going to see the end of a woman's right to choose? Are we going to see the end of marriage equality? Are we going to see the military being used as a tool for the will of the president? Those are things that could happen depending on who sits in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And once you grasp those things, you're in a completely different position when you look at this race.
So let's talk about the race for something. I know it's been ugly. Is there anything about Jamaal Bowman that you respect?
Well, look, I think he's passionate about the things he believes in, and even if I don't agree with him on a particular point, I recognize that he has a certain drive and determination. He grew up in modest conditions, so did I. And he's achieved, so have I, and I respect the achievement that he's had in those areas.
So what should he respect about you?
I think that I am more than what he has framed me as. I think he's tried to frame me by demographics and other ways as some person that I am not. I have proven over 35 years to the people of Westchester County who I am and how much I care and how much I'm willing to understand government to get results. And those results are what carries me through moments like this when I get attacked and I get called awful things and people who don't know me from other parts of the country write in, they don't even spell my name right, and they say George Latimer is this and he's that and he's terrible. They don't know.
Who is George Latimer? What is George Latimer? Tell our, as we close out this section of the show, tell our viewers what you want them to know about you.
Look, I'm a blue-collar kid that grew up in the south side of Mount Vernon, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Westchester County. Both of my parents, Depression-era people, quit school, go to war, go to work in a factory. They worked with blue-collar hands, got me and my sister to go through college and have a better life. I've tried through my corporate years and my public years to never forget that. We have free buses. Why? Little George Latimer, Mom didn't have money for him to get on the bus, so he walked all the way across town to do the things he wanted to do. Wow. Today's little George Latimer, whatever his name is, can get on a free bus because we've learned from that and tried to do that. And I'd like to be appreciated for what I've done as a county executive and a state senator, not just described by some demographic which serves his political need. And I think the people in this district know that.
George Latimer, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you for joining with me, and thank you at home for joining me as well.